Yes, hello and welcome to our Swiss Biohealth News. Professor Holick from the US. We are very happy and very pleased to have you here. So we met each other 2 years ago for a vitamin D Congress in Frankfurt. And first of all, I would like to know if there are any new insights since then regarding your work. Is there something breaking news in vitamin D?
So there are really, at least in my opinion, three pieces of new information over the past 2 years, right? The first is that what is really intriguing to me is a study that looked at endothelial membrane stability. And even though it's an in vitro study, right? Mm-hmm. But as you know, the endothelial cells play a very critical role in maintaining good cardiovascular health and good immune health. And so a study was done to ask the question, what chemical compound would stabilize endothelial membranes? And if they could do that, that would therefore improve immune function and cardiovascular health. And after screening thousands of compounds, the compound that this group came up with was vitamin D3, not 25-hydroxyvitamin D3, not 125-dihydroxyvitamin D3, but vitamin D3 itself. We think that that's very important. We've always wondered about this issue of being exposed to sunlight, maintaining vitamin D levels versus taking these large doses of vitamin D periodically. And is there going to be any difference to your overall health? That study implies that maintaining an adequate blood level of vitamin D, separate from 25-hydroxyvitamin D, may play a very important role in immune function and endothelial cell stability.
Okay, so you said there would be three new insights.
The second one is a study out of California. And again, it's a study that just has interesting implications. We know, and the study showed roundworms that were treated with vitamin D lived longer. Now, it turns out that the reason that we, as we age, or roundworms, as they age, you wind up cross-linking proteins. Right? And the cross-linking of proteins is a process of aging. Well, for worms, it's a problem because if you cross-link their proteins, they can't move, they can't eat, and therefore they die. And so a study was done, and they gave just vitamin D3 to roundworms and showed that they lived much longer. And when they looked at gene expression, they showed that the gene that was being regulated was related to cross-linking of proteins. It prevented the cross-linking of proteins and therefore presumably could increase longevity.
I was studying a lot about the findings of David Sinclair from Harvard. So, and he's stating that there's just one chronic disease, and this disease is called aging. Do you believe in that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Has it as well maybe something to do with the sirtuins and maybe with other things like that the vitamin D3 could interact in this part of aging?
Yes, it could potentially.
Okay, that's very interesting. So because that is something we are working on the moment to better understand aging and to address aging, because if we could solve this problem, it would solve a lot of other things at the same time.
Amen. The third observation is one that we've made, that you're probably aware. Several years ago, we had reported in PLOS1 that if you give healthy adults for 3 months 2,000 units of vitamin D a day, and you get the white blood cells at the baseline and 3 months later, and look at gene expression analysis, that we showed about 291 genes were being up and down regulated, helping to regulate your immune system. Well, we have now followed up with a much longer study where we gave healthy adults either 600, 4,000, or 10,000 units a day for 24 weeks, so half a year. And we looked at their calcium metabolism because we wanted to know, if you continue to increase your vitamin D intake, do you continue to have an influence on calcium metabolism? Or could you dissociate vitamin D's non-calcemic effects from its calcemic effects? So we looked at parathyroid hormone levels, serum calcium levels, serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels, and we obtained white blood cells at the beginning and at the end of the study. And we did expression analysis. And we showed that on 600 units a day, there was basically no effect on parathyroid hormone and calcium metabolism. These individuals, by the way, were vitamin D deficient or insufficient. And I think that's important to note, because as you're probably aware, a lot of these studies that have recently come out, including the VITAL study and the D2D study for diabetes, I mean, most of these individuals were vitamin D sufficient to begin with. So giving vitamin D and thinking you're going to see a biologic effect, to me, I think is questionable at best. So what we showed was at 4,000 units a day, the PTH levels plateaued very nicely, just as expected. On 10,000 units a day, the PTH levels also plateaued but didn't change. Now we looked at gene expression, and there were three interesting observations. The first is, if you put somebody that's deficient or insufficient on 600 units a day, you can up and down regulate about 150 of their genes in their immune system. If you put them on 4,000 units a day, you get about 300 to 500 genes being regulated. But on 10,000 units a day, about 1,500 genes were up or down regulated. Right? So what we think we've done is to dissociate the calcemic effect of vitamin D, right? On 4,000 units a day is probably maximum benefit. But to get additional benefit potentially in your immune system and throughout your body, on 10,000 units a day, we saw a much more marked effect. And the blood levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D were consistent. 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels on 600 didn't change. 4,000 went up to about 30 to 40 nanograms per ml. But on 10,000, most of the individuals had a blood level of about 60 to 90 nanograms per ml. No one had hypercalcemia. No one demonstrated any toxicity.
So that's really amazing news, and shows that, because we are recommending our patients before surgery. We do huge surgeries, oral surgeries, and 4 weeks before, prior to the surgery, to 4 weeks after, we are recommending about 20,000 units per day. But in general, we would recommend about 10,000. To be honest, I take a lot more sometimes. And so, in your opinion, is there something like, I mean, so many people are talking about toxicity of vitamin D3. So have you seen any toxic effect in vitamin D3, and which level which amount you have to take to see a toxicity?
Right. So before I answer that question, I want to give you one more piece of information about that study that I just did mention.
Yeah.
And that is that we had some, if you look at that publication, which I would encourage you to do, if you look at, that these, what are called heat maps, that the genes that are blue are underexpressed and genes that are red are expressed or overexpressed. If you look at if 30 to 40% of the individuals that raise their blood levels to the same degree of about 80 nanograms per ml, had much less change in the expression of those genes, showing very clearly that there is individual responses, even if you have the same blood level, right? And so that can help maybe also explain a lot of the confusion in literature, because even if you raise the blood level, there are some people, for whatever reason that we don't understand yet, don't respond as well. They did have some response, but not the robust response that we've seen in others. Now, regarding toxicity, vitamin D intoxication is one of the rarest medical conditions in the world. And you're probably aware that before 1950, even Europe had fortified food with vitamin D. And so in England, for example, custard, milk, all kinds of products were fortified with vitamin D. And then in the early 1950s, there was an outbreak of hypercalcemia in infants. They had funny looking faces, and they had supravalvular aortic stenosis. They have a heart problem. So back in the early 50s, this happened in the UK, is that the House of Commons health group brought in the experts, and they were clueless as to what the cause was. So they reviewed the literature, and they found that if you give pregnant rats high doses of vitamin D, that they have hypercalcemia, of course, supravalvular aortic stenosis, and funny looking faces. So they concluded that that this observation must be related to what was seen in these infants. These infants also had mild mental retardation. So that caused great consternation in the UK. So immediately, laws were passed in the UK forbidding the fortification of anything with vitamin D, because they thought that this outbreak of hypercalcemia in these infants was due to overfortification of milk with vitamin D. They had no evidence for this. That law then went throughout Europe and throughout Asia and throughout South America. So even today, most European countries forbid, right, fortification of foods, right? Asia, same thing, and in South America. And most countries, right, require that you have a prescription or some doctor's note to be able to buy vitamin D, all for that reason. But what was the cause? The most likely cause was these children had Williams syndrome, right? Williams syndrome is a genetic disorder that causes alpha-facies and mild mental retardation, supravalvular aortic stenosis, and what's amazing, they have a hypersensitivity to vitamin D that can cause hypercalcemia. I've discussed this with a lot of the health officials in England, for example, with the House of Commons, and elsewhere in Brazil. I met with their health group. And even though everybody agrees that most likely that's the cause, no one has yet made the effort to change the laws. Happily, India, right, more than 50% of Indian population in India is vitamin D deficient. They've now done something about it. They now fortify milk and cooking oil with vitamin D2.
Have you got an idea what could have been the cause between the Williams syndrome so what was the...
Sorry, I'm talking too fast. So Williams syndrome causes alpha-facies. So funny looking faces, causes a heart problem, supravalvular aortic stenosis, right? And if you give them vitamin D, they have hypersensitivity. So they develop hypercalcemia, right?
Yes, but why we had so many infants with...
So many. It was only a couple dozen children.
Okay. So it was a correlation, but not a causality, something like this.
That's right.
Okay.
There were a couple of children that did have de-intoxication because they were getting huge amounts of cod liver oil and all kinds
Okay.
of other stuff. But no, these kids likely had Williams syndrome, right? Because it makes no sense, right? Even for an infant to become intoxicated, you're not going to wind up with funny looking faces. So they would have said that that happened during pregnancy. So a couple of more comments
Yeah.
about vitamin D intoxication, because even here in the United States, I have problems with my primary care physician colleagues, because a patient will come in with a blood level of, say, 80 to 100 nanograms per ml, right, which is 250 nanomoles per liter. And they'll say, oh my heavens, this is vitamin D toxicity. But vitamin D intoxication, you have to have hypercalcemia, right? And often at least a normal or high serum phosphate. And 25 hydroxy vitamin D typically is over 200 nanograms per ml. Okay. And even the Endocrine Society practice guidelines, right? I chaired that committee. We had recommended you don't see vitamin D intoxication until you're well over 150 to 200 nanograms per ml. Okay.
Okay. So I read in your work that you some time ago you recommended 400 to 2,000, something like this, international units. So is there, in the meantime, now in 2020, what is the amount you would recommend, the value, the international units you would recommend in general, and especially in times like the pandemic we are facing now at the moment? And is it, as I understood, that we should take it on a daily basis, because from nature it was not mean that we would have half a year of no sun, because humanity was born in or started in Africa, where we had every single day, 365 days a year, enough sun. And so because the half-life, as I understood, of the serum calcidiol is quite short, I think just 1 day, something like this. So what are your recommendations in general, and especially facing coronavirus?
So I have a couple of suggestions. So the first is based on the endocrine practice guidelines and my own experience. My recommendation, infants should be on at least 600, preferably 1,000 units a day during first year of life. Children, in my opinion, should be on minimum 600 as recommended by the endocrine practice guidelines. Up to 1,000 is perfectly safe. So I recommend for all parents with children 1,000 units a day. However, teenagers, I think, should be treated like adults. And that means that they should be on minimum 2,000 units a day. We showed a couple of years ago that healthy adults and teenagers that got 1,000 units a day, essentially none of them can raise their blood level above that 30 nanogram per ml range where we want everybody to be. But preferably, I personally take 6,000 units of vitamin D a day. And there's a very good study out of Canada showing up to 10 to 20,000 units a day is perfectly safe, especially if you're obese. Because if you're obese, you need 2 to 3 times more vitamin D.
Okay. And of course, we should take it every single day, not just once a week.
So it's a catch-22, right? And that is that especially for my elder patients, right, I recommend that they take 50,000 units every 2 weeks for good compliance, right? But for those that really want to maximize their health and get the full benefit of vitamin D, you're correct. I think everybody should be taking it on a daily basis.
And what would you say is the target value in nanograms? Should we between 40 and 60 or maybe even higher?
Right. So my level's around 72 on 6,000 units a day, which is totally predictable, right? We know that if you're at a level of 20, for every 100 units you ingest, you raise your blood level by 0.6 to 1 nanogram per ml. And then it begins to plateau. So people think that if you're on, say, 10,000 units a day, that you're going to continue to go up like this. No. What happens is that you go up and then you maintain that blood level at around 60 to 80 nanograms per ml. And so the Endocrine Society recommends preferred range 40 to 60, but certainly up to 100 is perfectly safe. And there's no evidence one way or the other whether 60 versus 80 makes any difference. And as I had mentioned to you before, from our study on 10,000 units a day, some people had a much more robust response on their gene expression compared to others.